Drums throbbed beneath the church eaves as townsfolk packed the aisle, fans fluttering, whispers prickling like nettles, while the bride stepped into the doorway and lowered her veil to hide the shaking of her mouth. Evelyn's hands clutched wildflowers so tight the stems squeaked. She had not spoken since winter. Not a word, not a prayer, and the town had decided silence meant weakness, pride, or worse. Laughter started as a pinprick, one woman's smothered giggle trembling into a wave. Then a ranger barked, "Heh," and a boy snorted until the whole room simmered with mean delight at the quiet girl who would not say "I do." Wyatt Hale stood at the front in a black coat that could not tame the dust of his ranch, jaw dark with stubble, eyes the gray of stormed-over tin. He watched the trembling bouquet, the quick swallow in Evelyn's throat, the way her shoes stalled at the first pew as if the floor were ice. Mayor Briggs cleared his throat and declared the union a mercy upon a shy soul, which birthed another hiss of laughter near the windows, where the light came in like knives. Evelyn lifted her gaze once and saw faces she had baked bread for, stitched cloth for, sat with in grief, and those faces curled with the kind of curiosity that opens into cruelty. Her chest closed, soundless. A girl in blue whispered she must be simple. A man in a brown hat said maybe she lied about her past, and someone behind them said curse like they wanted the word to bite. The minister asked if the bride wished to speak her vow, and that was when the whispering became performance, a theater of expectant cruelty, heads tilting to watch the failure arrive. Evelyn's lungs reached for a word that would not come. Winter pressed through her. The red barn, the moonlit road, a shadow dragging a body by the creek. Every memory tasted of iron and fire. Across the aisle, Clara, queen of gossip, lifted her chin and let her smile sharpen. "Say anything," she sighed to her friends, "even a squeak." Evelyn's fingers loosened, and a single blossom fell and burst against the plank floor. Wyatt moved. He stepped down from the altar, and the room startled at the certainty in his stride, at the way his shoulders said no farther. He reached Evelyn, did not touch her yet, only placed himself between her and the crowd like a door that would not open. He said the bride will not be tried by spectacle today. A man laughed and said then she is not fit to be a wife if she cannot speak for herself. Wyatt did not raise his voice. He let it land slow and heavy, the way a fence post finds the hole. Her voice is mine to protect. The words rolled through the rafters, and the roof seemed to lean closer to hear them. Heat flushed Evelyn's cheeks, and the veil swam in her breath. He turned, shoulders square to the rows of faces, and said, "If she wishes to speak, I will hold the quiet until it arrives. If she does not, I have heard enough from her hands and her work and the way she shields children when riders thunder through." The laughter withered. Evelyn stood straighter. Then the doors blew wide, and a latecomer strode in, ash on his coat, and her heart began to hammer a warning none of the others could yet hear. The heavy doors slammed against the church wall as Silas Crow swaggered inside, his boots clapping sharp against the floorboards, a false smile splitting his handsome, fox-like face, while the crowd shifted like a single body, half gasping, half sighing, as though salvation had arrived. Evelyn flinched behind her veil, the flowers trembling in her grip, because she knew what the others didn't, that this man's smile was only a mask stretched over cruelty, a promise of pain disguised as charm. Wyatt's storm-gray eyes narrowed, his stance widening slightly, an instinctive barrier between Evelyn and the newcomer. Silas raised his hands as if to calm a storm, his voice warm and mocking as honey left too long in the sun. Now, friends, no need for all this noise. A wedding should be joy, not confusion." He strode down the aisle with deliberate slowness, letting every eye track him like a predator's hunt. And when he reached Clara's pew, he brushed her shoulder lightly, earning a blush that only deepened her loyalty to him. The mayor sputtered, clearly unsettled, but Silas spoke over him, saying it seemed to him a wife should speak her own vows. Otherwise, how could they know her heart? A murmur rippled through the room, some nodding. Others whispering that perhaps Wyatt's bold claim moments earlier was too strange, too sudden. Clara's voice rang like a bell, cold and sweet. She said it herself. She said nothing at all. Perhaps silence means consent to sin. The crowd tittered, emboldened by the poisonous remark, and Evelyn's knees nearly buckled beneath her. Wyatt's voice cut through the rising noise like a whip crack. That's enough. He turned slowly, his face carved from stone, and repeated, "Her voice is mine to protect." Every syllable struck like hammer blows, and for a breathless moment even Silas paused. But then Silas smiled wider, tilting his head as though indulging a child's game. "How noble," he said smoothly, "yet how dangerous. A woman who does not speak is a mystery, and mysteries have a way of hiding truths too terrible to bear. Perhaps your silent bride carries a past so foul she dare not let it touch the air." Clara seized the moment, gasping theatrically and clinging to her friends, as if they were shielding her from some creeping darkness. The crowd shifted again, now leaning toward Silas, their fear stoked by his careful insinuations. Evelyn wanted to scream, to shout the truth she had swallowed for so long, but the memories surged, the shadow dragging the body, the hissed threat by the frozen creek, the smell of burned cloth, and her throat closed, trapping the words like birds in a cage. Wyatt stepped forward, planting himself before Silas, his height and strength a wall of defiance. "You know more than you say," he growled, "and someday you'll choke on it." Silas's eyes glimmered like oil in sunlight. Someday, perhaps, but not today. He leaned close, his voice low and meant only for Wyatt. "She saw me, didn't she? That's why she's mute." Wyatt's hands curled into fists, but Silas only laughed softly, then turned to the crowd with a flourish. "Friends, let us not forget, this is a holy day. I only wish for truth to prevail." He bowed mockingly and swept out, leaving a trail of unease behind him. As the doors swung closed, the congregation erupted into clashing voices, some defending Evelyn, others damning her. The mayor tried and failed to restore order. Wyatt gathered Evelyn into his arms and carried her out into the cold dusk, his jaw set. Behind her veil, Evelyn's tears burned. She pressed her hand against his chest and traced a single word in the dust on his coat. Danger. Wyatt's breath hissed between his teeth. He understood now that her silence was not weakness, but a shield against a man who would stop at nothing to bury his crime. As they rode hard toward his ranch, a distant column of smoke rose in the fading light, and Evelyn's heart sank, because she knew what Silas burned when he wished to warn her. It was her veil, and the war for truth had just begun. The horses thundered across the darkening prairie, Wyatt leaning low over his stallion's neck, Evelyn clinging to his waist as the wind clawed at her veil, the sound of her ragged breathing lost beneath the pounding hooves. When they crested the final hill, the sight below wrenched a gasp from even Wyatt's battle-hardened throat. The yard before his ranch house was ablaze with a cruel, deliberate fire, tongues of orange and black devouring a heap of smoldering fabric and wood, the smoke rising like a twisted banner into the dusk. Evelyn's hands flew to her face, a silent cry tearing from her chest as she slid from the saddle before Wyatt could stop her, stumbling toward the inferno with her arms outstretched, because there, amid the flames, was the last piece of her past she had clung to, her wedding veil, scorched and blackened, pinned to a stake like a trophy. Wyatt caught her by the shoulders, dragging her back from the heat, his voice rough with fury as he shouted over the crackling blaze that this was Silas's doing, a message meant to terrify her into submission. Evelyn shook her head violently, tears streaking her soot-streaked face, then dropped to her knees and clawed through the dirt until her fingers closed around a charred scrap of lace, clutching it to her chest, as if by sheer will she could keep it from vanishing completely. Wyatt knelt beside her, his hands steady even as rage trembled beneath his skin, promising that Silas would pay for this, and that no fire, no threat, could take her from him. But even as he spoke, hoofbeats drummed in the distance, and James, his foreman, rode up wild-eyed, shouting that trouble was brewing in town. The mayor had called an emergency gathering, stirred by Silas's poisonous words, and half the townsfolk were ready to turn on Evelyn entirely, demanding that Wyatt annul the marriage or face exile. Wyatt's jaw clenched, his storm-gray eyes darkening like the sky before a storm. Evelyn tugged at his sleeve, then reached for the patch of dirt beside the burned veil, tracing letters with trembling fingers. Creak. Body. Silence. Wyatt's breath caught as the fragments of truth began to align. She had witnessed something horrific, something tied to Silas, and the threat to keep her quiet had been sealed by violence. He cupped her face gently, murmuring that he believed her, that her silence was not shame, but courage. And he would uncover the rest no matter the cost. Evelyn buried her face against his chest, drawing strength from his steady heartbeat, then pulled away and pointed to the stable, urging him to go. Wyatt understood. This was bigger than them now. If Silas convinced the town to see Evelyn as a cursed liar, they would lose more than land or reputation. They would lose their lives. As darkness fell, Wyatt gathered evidence, scraps of burnt wood that bore markings only Silas could have made, while Evelyn carefully wrapped the ruined veil in cloth, her hands shaking with both grief and determination. When they rode toward town, the night seemed alive with whispers, shadows of riders darting between the trees, and Evelyn clutched Wyatt's coat as if it were the only solid thing in a world tilting toward chaos. At the edge of the square, they saw torches flaring, the angry roar of a crowd rising like a tide. Clara stood at the front, her face lit with malicious glee as she shouted that Evelyn's silence was proof of guilt, that she had brought a curse upon them all. Silas emerged behind her, smiling like a benevolent savior, and raised his hands for quiet. Evelyn's grip tightened, her eyes burning with unshed tears. Wyatt dismounted and drew his revolver, his voice ringing like iron as he declared that tonight the truth would speak, even if it had to do so through fire and blood. The town square boiled with fury beneath the torchlight, shadows of pitchforks and fists stretching across the wooden facades as men shouted accusations and women clutched their children, their fear feeding the fire Silas had so carefully stoked. Evelyn sat stiffly on the horse behind Wyatt, her hands fisted in the fabric of his coat, her wide eyes darting from face to face as the crowd parted to reveal Clara, standing smugly on the steps of the council hall, her lips painted with false sorrow. Silas moved beside her like a serpent disguised as a preacher, lifting his arms high as if to calm the very chaos he had unleashed. "Friends," he called, his voice smooth and honeyed, "we are gathered because evil walks among us cloaked in silence." His gaze swept dramatically toward Evelyn, who lowered her head beneath her scorched veil as gasps rippled through the throng. Silas continued, spinning his tale with masterful ease, saying a woman who refuses to speak carries a heart poisoned by secrets and lies, and her refusal to confess is a danger to every man, woman, and child in this town. Wyatt swung down from his horse, his boots striking the dirt like hammer blows, and his voice thundered above the din that Evelyn's silence was born of terror, not guilt. That he had seen the truth in her eyes and would defend it with his last breath. Clara laughed, a brittle sound that slithered through the crowd, and cried out that Wyatt was blinded by lust, willing to sacrifice the safety of the town for a woman too cowardly to speak. The people surged forward, some shouting for Evelyn to be cast out, others merely staring with conflicted eyes, torn between the authority of Silas and the steady honor of Wyatt. Evelyn's trembling fingers brushed Wyatt's sleeve, and she slid from the horse to stand beside him, her veil fluttering like a wounded bird. She turned to the dirt at her feet, and, using a stick, scratched 3 desperate words into the packed earth. Creek, blood, murder. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of torches. Silas's eyes gleamed with sudden malice, his mask slipping for a heartbeat before he composed himself, declaring that her crude symbols were nothing but hysterical lies meant to destroy an innocent man's reputation. Wyatt stepped closer, his body shielding Evelyn, and shouted that he had evidence. Burned wood marked with Silas's crest, proof that the veil fire was no accident. But Silas, always a step ahead, gestured to Clara, who pulled a folded paper from her dress and proclaimed that it was a sworn statement from 2 townsmen who claimed Evelyn was seen wandering at night near the creek like a ghost, perhaps even involved in dark rituals. The crowd gasped, the weight of lies crushing the fragile seed of truth. Wyatt's hand tightened on his revolver, rage boiling, but Evelyn's hand touched his wrist, silently begging him not to fight with bullets but with faith. She turned then, facing the crowd fully for the first time, lifting her scorched veil to reveal her tear-streaked face. Though her lips moved soundlessly, her eyes burned with a plea so fierce it cut through the clamor, and for a fleeting moment some hearts wavered. Silas seized that moment to strike, his voice rising like a whip, commanding the people to seize Wyatt and the cursed bride before dawn. The mob roared its approval, surging forward, and Wyatt scooped Evelyn into his arms, fighting through the crush of bodies toward the alley. As they vanished into the darkness, Evelyn clutched the burnt veil to her chest, knowing now that Silas would never stop until her silence was broken. Or her life was. Wyatt's voice was grim in her ear as he swore they would find the body before Silas buried every trace of his crime, and when they returned, the truth would burn brighter than his lies. The moon rode high and silver as Wyatt's horse pounded through the dark woods, branches whipping past while Evelyn clung to his back, her scorched veil wrapped tightly around her shoulders, as if it could ward off the terror clawing at her chest. Behind them, the sounds of the mob faded into distant echoes, replaced by the rushing murmur of the creek that haunted Evelyn's dreams. Wyatt slowed as they reached the clearing, where the water curled like a black snake through the rocks, dismounting in a single fluid motion and pulling Evelyn down beside him. Her bare feet sank into the cold mud, and her body trembled as memories assaulted her. The night she had hidden here, silent among the reeds, watching Silas drag a lifeless figure through the shallows beneath a bleeding moon. Wyatt's hands were steady as he gripped her shoulders, his storm-gray eyes locked on hers. "Show me," he urged softly, and Evelyn took a deep, shuddering breath before turning toward a half-submerged log near the far bank. She waded through the icy water, lifting her veil to point at a cluster of stones deliberately stacked in a way that spoke of human hands. Wyatt crouched and began pulling the stones free, his muscles straining, until a dark cloth floated upward, followed by the pale outline of a boot. Evelyn covered her mouth, silent sobs racking her frame as Wyatt revealed what she had feared to see again. A body, long drowned, bound at the ankles with rope marked by a distinctive knot only ranchers used. Wyatt's jaw tightened, rage simmering like molten iron. Silas had not merely silenced Evelyn with threats, he had murdered a man and hidden the proof beneath the very creek where she had first learned terror. He examined the rope carefully, noting a small brass emblem tied within the fibers, engraved with the symbol of Silas's cattle brand. Evelyn knelt beside him. Tracing her fingers over the emblem, her wide eyes pleading with him to understand the depth of the danger. Wyatt folded the evidence into a leather pouch, his mind already spinning with plans. With this, he growled, we can expose him before the town, but only if we move fast. Evelyn nodded, her tears shimmering in the moonlight, and pointed toward the path back to town. As they prepared to leave, a low rustle froze them both. From the darkness, a rifle barrel gleamed, and a shot split the night. Wyatt shoved Evelyn into the water just as the bullet whined past his head, splintering a nearby tree. Rough laughter followed, and 3 of Silas's hired men emerged from the brush, their faces twisted with cruel delight. The boss said you'd come sniffing around, one sneered, swinging his rifle, said to make sure you don't leave. Wyatt drew his revolver with lightning speed, firing a single shot that dropped the first man before he could blink, but the other 2 charged. Evelyn, half submerged, grabbed a broken branch and hurled it, striking one attacker's face and giving Wyatt a precious second to tackle him into the mud. The third man lunged for Evelyn, who scrambled backward, clutching her veil like a shield, until Wyatt's blade flashed in the moonlight and the man fell silent forever. Breathing hard, Wyatt wiped the blood from his hands and hauled Evelyn close, his voice a harsh whisper. Silas knows we found the body. He'll be ready to spin another lie before dawn. Evelyn pressed her forehead to his chest, then pulled back and dipped her fingers into the creek, writing a single word in the wet sand. Hurry. Wyatt nodded grimly, lifting her onto the horse. As they rode through the night toward the sleeping town, Evelyn clutched the pouch of evidence, her heart pounding with equal parts hope and fear, knowing that when the sun rose, either the truth would set her free or the lies would bury them both forever. The horizon was only a faint gray whisper when Wyatt and Evelyn reached the edge of town, their horse lathered with sweat, its flanks trembling from the relentless ride. The streets were eerily quiet, lit only by the glow of torches outside the council hall, where Silas's men stood like sentinels, their rifles glinting faintly in the pre-dawn mist. Wyatt dismounted silently, lifting Evelyn down with care, his storm-gray eyes scanning every shadow. Evelyn clutched the leather pouch to her chest, the charred veil wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her breath coming in short, frantic gasps. She knew that inside that hall, Silas was already weaving another net of lies, and if they didn't reach the council before sunrise, the evidence would mean nothing. Wyatt crouched beside her, speaking in a low voice only she could hear, telling her to stay hidden until his signal. Evelyn shook her head fiercely, her fingers gripping his sleeve, her wide eyes pleading to stand beside him no matter the danger. Wyatt's chest tightened with both pride and fear. She had been mocked, hunted, silenced, yet she still burned with courage. He kissed her forehead briefly, then nodded, whispering, "Then we fight together." They crept through the back alleys, the smell of damp earth and smoke filling their lungs. As they neared the hall, the low rumble of voices became clear. Silas was addressing the council and the gathered crowd with smooth authority, painting a picture of Wyatt as a dangerous madman and Evelyn as a cursed creature whose silence hid unspeakable sins. Clara's shrill interjections punctuated his speech, her words like poisoned arrows as she spread tales of witchcraft and murder. The crowd murmured uneasily, fear and hatred swirling together, ready to ignite at the slightest spark. Wyatt's jaw clenched as he listened, his hand tightening around the pouch of evidence. Evelyn trembled beside him, her fingers brushing the scorched veil for strength. Then Silas's voice rose, commanding and triumphant. "At dawn," he declared, "the silent bride will be cast out beyond the borders, and if Wyatt resists, he will face the law's final judgment." The crowd roared in approval, their torches lifted high, and for a moment Wyatt's vision swam with red fury. But before he could step forward, Evelyn moved past him, her face pale but resolute. She walked into the torchlight, her veil fluttering like a ghost's wing, and the crowd fell silent, startled by her sudden appearance. Silas froze, his false smile cracking, but only for a heartbeat before he masked it again. "Look at her," he sneered, "a woman who cannot even defend herself with words. Do you trust your lives to such a creature?" Evelyn turned slowly, meeting the eyes of the people who had mocked her, and then she knelt on the packed earth, tracing in bold, steady strokes. Creak, blood, truth. A ripple of unease ran through the crowd. Clara tried to laugh it off, but her voice faltered when Wyatt strode into view, lifting the dripping rope and brass emblem high for all to see. "This," Wyatt roared, "is the voice she was denied. This rope bound the man Silas murdered, and this brand ties it to him." Gasps erupted, and the crowd surged forward, half believing, half clinging to their fear. Silas's mask shattered, his face twisted with rage as he drew a hidden pistol, shouting that none of them would live to see him fall. The first shot exploded into chaos. Wyatt shoved Evelyn behind a water trough as people screamed and scattered. Flames leapt as a torch toppled, catching a wagon wheel, and suddenly the square was ablaze, smoke and fire turning dawn into a nightmare. Over the roar, Wyatt's voice cut through, shouting that this was their last chance to stand for truth. Evelyn clutched the veil to her chest, her eyes blazing with determination. She knew that before the sun fully rose, she would either find her voice or lose it forever in the fire Silas had lit. The square was chaos, a storm of smoke and fire swallowing shouts of terror as panicked townsfolk stumbled through the red glow, their torches now weapons turned against them by the wind. Evelyn crouched behind the water trough, her heart pounding like a trapped bird, while the scorched veil wrapped tight around her shoulders stung her skin with the smell of ash. Through the haze, she saw Silas, his face twisted and raw, shoving Clara aside as he fired wildly into the crowd, his shouts turning to guttural roars of desperation. Wyatt moved like a shadow through the smoke, his storm-gray eyes locked on Silas. Every motion deliberate and unyielding. Evelyn's breath caught when she saw a terrified child, little Jonah, stumble into Silas's path, his small hands raised as if to ward off the danger. Silas sneered and raised his pistol, and Evelyn's scream tore free, but only inside her chest, silent as always, her voice strangled by terror. Wyatt dove forward, slamming into Silas and knocking the weapon skyward just as the shot exploded harmlessly into the night. They grappled viciously, fists and fury, while the crowd surged around them, torn between fleeing and fighting. Clara, her fine dress torn and sooty, screamed Silas's name, but when he turned to her, it was not with love, but with loathing. "You're nothing but a pawn," he spat, shoving her hard into a wagon wheel. Her shriek was drowned by the crackle of flames as the fire leapt higher, devouring the hall's wooden porch. Evelyn clutched the leather pouch, knowing the evidence inside was their only hope, but a group of Silas's men blocked her path, their eyes gleaming with cruelty. Wyatt saw them and roared her name, wordless yet fierce, as he fought to break free, but Silas twisted, ramming a knee into Wyatt's ribs and sending him sprawling. One of the thugs lunged for Evelyn, ripping the veil from her shoulders and tossing it into the fire with a mocking laugh. Rage boiled inside her, hotter than the flames licking at the sky. For so long, she had hidden in silence, but now, faced with losing everything, something deep within her snapped. Evelyn ducked beneath the thug's grasp, seized a fallen torch, and swung it with all her strength, the fiery tip striking his temple with a sickening thud. He dropped, stunned, and she turned on the others, her eyes blazing like coals. The crowd gasped, seeing the silent bride fight like a storm unleashed. Wyatt, blood streaking his face, surged to his feet and tackled Silas again, forcing him toward the council steps. Clara crawled from the shadows, tears streaking her filthy cheeks as she screamed at the crowd that Silas had lied, that she had been a fool to serve him. Some listened, others turned away, but the seeds of doubt spread. Evelyn stumbled to Wyatt's side, clutching his arm, and together they forced Silas to his knees. Wyatt shouted to the people, holding the burnt rope and emblem aloft, that this was proof of Silas's guilt, but Silas laughed through broken teeth, spitting blood. "You think they'll believe you over fear? Fear is louder than truth." He wrenched free, grabbing a dropped pistol, and leveled it at Evelyn's heart. Wyatt's roar was primal as he dove between them, the shot echoing like thunder. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of fire and Evelyn's ragged breaths. Wyatt staggered, clutching his side, while Silas fled into the inferno, vanishing into smoke. Evelyn fell to her knees beside Wyatt, her hands pressing against his wound as tears streamed down her face. Her lips moved, forming words she could not release. In that moment, her silence was no longer just a burden. It was a vow. If Wyatt lived, she would find her voice, and she would speak the truth herself, no matter what it cost. The smoke hung thick and choking as dawn's first pale light struggled to pierce the destruction. The once proud town square now a battlefield of shattered wagons, burned timbers, and the ash of broken lies. Evelyn knelt in the dirt beside Wyatt, her hands pressed against the blood seeping through his shirt, her tears streaking clean paths down her soot-stained cheeks as she silently begged him to stay with her. Wyatt's storm-gray eyes fluttered open, pain flashing within them, but his voice was steady as he rasped that Silas wasn't gone, that the fight wasn't over. Around them, the townsfolk gathered hesitantly, their earlier rage now hollowed into fear and shame. Clara staggered forward, her fine dress torn to rags, her voice hoarse as she confessed before all that Silas had deceived her, that she had been his pawn in spreading lies about Evelyn. Some gasped, some wept, but many turned accusing stares toward the silent bride, still caught between old beliefs and dawning truth. Silas's remaining men lingered at the edges of the crowd, their hands hovering near weapons, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Evelyn rose slowly, her body trembling not from fear, but from the weight of choice. For so long she had been silent, locked away by terror and threats, but she saw now that words were the only weapon left to her. She unwrapped the scorched veil from her shoulders and held it high, the blackened lace fluttering like a battle flag, and the crowd's murmurs fell away into stunned stillness. She turned to the packed earth and, with deliberate precision, traced the same 3 words she had written before. Creek, blood, truth. Some recognized the message and whispered of the hidden body by the water. Silas's men shifted uneasily, their confidence fraying. Evelyn dropped the stick and faced them, her lips trembling, her chest heaving as she tried to force sound past the wall of fear that had imprisoned her for so long. She thought of Wyatt bleeding behind her, of the night she had hidden in the reeds and seen Silas drag the lifeless form into the current, of the fire that had consumed her veil and nearly her hope. Then, from deep within her, a single word burst free, ragged and raw but unmistakable. Murder. It ripped through the air like a thunderclap, silencing every breath, every whisper, every lingering doubt. Evelyn's voice, once lost, now rang with undeniable truth. She staggered, the effort nearly breaking her, but she did not stop. With shaking hands, she pointed toward the leather pouch Wyatt had fought to protect. A councilman stepped forward, opening it with trembling fingers to reveal the rope and brass emblem. Gasps erupted as recognition spread. The brand was Silas's, proof of guilt beyond dispute. The crowd turned, fury rising, just as Silas himself stumbled from the smoke, his face streaked with soot, his eyes wild. He screamed that they were all fools, that fear would always rule them, and he charged toward Evelyn, pistol raised. But this time, the town moved as one. James, Wyatt's loyal foreman, tackled Silas to the ground, wrenching the weapon away as others pinned his arms. Clara, weeping, begged forgiveness, but no one looked at her. Wyatt forced himself to his feet, leaning on James, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. She rushed to him, cradling his face, and for the first time her voice came again, soft and unbroken. Wyatt. The crowd erupted, their cheers mingling with sobs, as Evelyn's newfound strength shattered the last chains of Silas's reign. Wyatt wrapped his arms around her, whispering that her voice had been hers all along, and now it would never be silenced again. Above them, the rising sun bathed the square in gold, burning away the smoke. As the people knelt not before fear, but before the truth Evelyn had finally spoken. The rising sun bathed the shattered square in fragile light, illuminating the faces of the townsfolk as they clutched one another, torn between relief and terror. Silas, pinned to the ground by James and two other men, writhed like a venomous snake, his eyes burning with hatred as he spat curses at Evelyn and Wyatt. Evelyn stood trembling, her scorched veil clutched in one hand, her other gripping Wyatt's blood-stained shirt as though her touch alone could hold him upright. Her voice, though raw and fragile, carried enough strength to silence the murmurs around her. "He murdered to keep his lies hidden," she said. Her words like fragile glass striking stone. "He will never stop unless he is ended." The crowd gasped, some stepping back, others pressing forward in angry agreement. Silas laughed then, a harsh, grating sound, and in one brutal twist he flung James aside, snatched a dropped knife, and lunged to his feet. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn screamed, her newfound voice tearing the morning air, as Wyatt shoved her behind him. Silas slashed wildly, catching Wyatt across the arm before sprinting toward the edge of the square. The mob erupted into chaos. Clara screamed for help, clutching at a wounded man, while others shouted to give chase. Wyatt's storm-gray eyes burned like coals as he ripped the rifle from James's hands and leapt onto his horse with a grimace of pain. Evelyn ran forward, her veil streaming behind her, shouting that he couldn't go alone. Wyatt looked back at her, his voice a fierce promise. "I swore to protect your voice. That vow doesn't end here." Before Evelyn could protest, he spurred the horse and thundered down the dirt road after Silas, the pounding hooves echoing like war drums. Evelyn fell to her knees, tears streaking her soot-streaked cheeks, then rose with sudden resolve. She gathered a small group of townsfolk, Clara included, and urged them to follow on foot, her voice cracking but determined. Wyatt pursued Silas through the hills, the chase a blur of sweat and rage. Silas fired wildly over his shoulder, bullets sparking against rocks as Wyatt ducked low, his jaw clenched. The memory of Evelyn's voice drove him forward, each shout of murder still ringing in his ears. Finally, they reached the edge of the creek, the same cursed place where Evelyn's nightmare had begun. Silas dismounted, scrambling over the rocks, his breath ragged, his knife flashing in the pale light. Wyatt dismounted as well, his boots sinking into the wet earth. The stench of rot and old secrets heavy in the air. Silas turned, his face twisted in desperation. "You think you've won," he snarled, "but the town will never forget her silence. Even now they doubt her. She will always be a shadow." Wyatt's voice was low and deadly. "Then I will be her son." They collided like raging bulls, fists and blades clashing, the creek's cold water splashing around them. Silas fought like a man possessed, landing blow after blow, but Wyatt's fury was unrelenting. When Silas raised the knife for a killing strike, Wyatt grabbed his wrist and twisted, sending the blade spinning into the current. With a roar, Wyatt drove Silas backward into the creek where the stones had once hidden the murdered body. Silas thrashed, his eyes wide with terror as Wyatt forced him under. A moment later, the rushing water went still. Wyatt staggered back, chest heaving as Evelyn's group arrived just in time to see Silas's lifeless body carried downstream, his lies washed away by the very water that had concealed his crimes. Evelyn ran to Wyatt, throwing her arms around him, her voice trembling as she cried his name for all to hear. Wyatt held her tight, whispering that the darkness was ended, but her voice must now guide the town to healing. Together, they turned toward the rising sun, ready to return and face the uncertain future with truth as their only weapon. The morning sun spread its golden light across the battered town, washing away the ash and smoke of the terrible night, as if the earth itself wished to cleanse the memories of blood and fire. Evelyn walked beside Wyatt through the main street, her scorched veil trailing lightly behind her like a flag of survival, her hand tightly gripping his. The townsfolk gathered in silence, their faces pale, their hearts weighed down by guilt and awe. Clara stood apart, her once proud posture bowed beneath the weight of shame, while mothers clutched their children and men shifted uncomfortably, remembering how easily they had been swayed by Silas's lies. Wyatt's arm was bound from the wound Silas had given him, but his back was straight, and his storm-gray eyes were unbroken as he led Evelyn to the steps of the council hall. The same place where Silas had poisoned their ears with deceit now waited to hear the truth. James raised his voice above the crowd, announcing that Silas Crow was dead and his crimes laid bare. A murmur spread, some gasping in relief, others hanging their heads, knowing they had been part of his cruelty. Clara wept openly, falling to her knees, begging Evelyn for forgiveness. Evelyn's gaze lingered on her sister for a long, heavy moment before she spoke softly. "Enough for all to hear. Forgiveness is not silence, Clara. It is choosing to speak even when the world does not wish to listen." The crowd shifted, stunned to hear the once silent bride's voice, clear and steady despite its fragile tone. Wyatt squeezed her hand and nodded for her to step forward. Evelyn's heart raced, but she raised her chin and let her words flow, trembling but unstoppable. She told them how she had seen Silas murder a man by the creek, how fear had locked her voice inside her for months, while Silas used her silence as a weapon to control the town. She told them of Wyatt's unwavering belief, of the fire meant to destroy her spirit, and of the night she finally chose to speak the word murder aloud, breaking the chains Silas had bound around her heart. As she spoke, tears streamed freely from many eyes, the weight of their complicity crashing down upon them. Men who had once mocked her now lowered their heads in shame. Women reached out with trembling hands as if to touch a piece of her courage, and children stared at her as though seeing a hero step out of a story. When she finished, there was silence, a deep, sacred quiet that felt different from the oppressive silence she had once carried. This was the silence of understanding, of change. Then, slowly, one by one, the townsfolk knelt before her, pledging to never again let fear twist their voices into weapons of hate. Wyatt helped her down the steps, his voice strong as he declared that justice would rebuild this town, not vengeance, and that Evelyn's courage would light their way. James stepped forward with the leather pouch, now empty, and handed her the scorched veil. With trembling fingers, she tied it to the top of the council's flagpole, the blackened lace fluttering against the bright sky, a symbol of truth rising from destruction. As the sun climbed higher, Evelyn turned to Wyatt. Tears glimmering like stars in her eyes, she whispered his name, and he kissed her brow, murmuring that her voice had been hers all along. He had only guarded it until she was ready to claim it. Together they walked through the square, no longer hunted, no longer silent. The people parted before them, not with mockery or suspicion, but with reverence. And when Evelyn's voice rang out once more, strong and free, the town listened, not out of fear, but out of hope, knowing that from this day forward truth would never again be buried beneath the weight of lies.